Okay, so you want to know who really shot Mr. Burns, huh? Well, you might not like the answer. This theory is way out there, so all the disclaimers from part 1 still apply. Before revealing the solution, however, let me ask you a couple of questions. Of everyone in Springfield, who has the strongest motive for shooting Mr. Burns? Who is the one person during part 1 who repeatedly and personally witnesses the consequences of Mr. Burns' bad deeds, who watches as everyone close to them suffers by his hand? Or alternatively, who is the one person in Springfield who Mr. Burns likes, or even loves, enough that he would cover up a shooting for them? That's right, Mr. Burns was actually shot by Marge Simpson. See, I told you the solution would be really crazy. We are literally accusing the one person that we know for a fact couldn't be the shooter. And yet somehow, here we are. Marge is quite possibly the only character in Springfield who could explain why Mr. Burns would want to cover up for his own shooter. Unless he were doing it for some kind of financial gain, the only explanation for a cover-up would be that the shooter would have to be someone that Burns is fond of. And not just fond of, I mean we're talking about forgiving someone for shooting him. It would have to be someone that Burns is head over heels in love with. Enter Marge Simpson. Up to this point in the series, Burns has fallen in love with exactly two characters, with Marge Simpson being the first during the episode Marge Gets a Job. Much like Who Shot Mr. Burns, this is another Oakley and Weinstein written episode, which is left somewhat open-ended. Open-ended in that it's somewhat debatable whether Mr. Burns ever got over his infatuation with her. Remember, this wasn't something like Burns' Heir, where Bart and Mr. Burns have a falling out in the end. In Marge Gets a Job, he chooses to let Marge and Homer go free, and even throws a concert for them. And then later in season 5, he almost marries Marge's mother. I think it's safe to say that Mr. Burns loves him some Bouvier women. Well, except for maybe these two. Although who knows, maybe in season 30. So in summary, Marge is basically the only person where a Burns cover-up theory could even be viable. There is no other character in Springfield that Burns is close enough to that it could make any sense. And coincidentally, Marge is the only person in Springfield who couldn't have done it. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's take a look at Marge Simpson as a character. At first glance, it would seem preposterous that Marge could shoot anyone. She is the nice character of the show, the level-headed one who always keeps her cool. And although Marge generally acts as the calming, motherly presence on the series, to pigeonhole her as a strictly passive participant does a great injustice to her character. Marge has repeatedly and consistently been shown to be a person who explodes when repeatedly put under pressure. Remember her freakout during Homer Alone? Or how about her road rage in season 10? Or maybe that time she started purposefully injuring Homer? This is a character who represses her problems and lets it stew inside of her. This is also a character who has an interesting history with guns. Don't let Marge's squeamishness in part 1 fool you. This is someone who knows how to operate a firearm. And what's more, the series has actually given us a character arc about Marge's relationship with them. She got her first taste of it during Marge on the Lam when Ruth Powers shows her how to shoot precious antique cans. She honed her skills when she joined the police force in the Springfield Connection, passing the shooting exam with flying colors. And let's not forget how the later episode, The Cartridge Family, ended. After Homer gives up his gun for good, Marge finds it too irresistible to let go, and secretly keeps it for herself. This is a character who is very familiar with firearms, so the notion of Marge being too squeamish to be the shooter is patently absurd. Obviously, the fact that she's familiar with guns doesn't mean she did it, however. It just makes her, like a ton of other characters, viable as a suspect. For the real evidence, let's take a look at Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1. Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1 is an episode that focuses very heavily on establishing characters' motives. The episode is essentially a lengthy string of motive scenes, one after another. And with a Maggie Simpson solution, all of these scenes are entirely inconsequential to the mystery. But a Marge Simpson solution perfectly explains why they devote so much of the episode to these scenes. For you see, Marge's motive for committing the shooting is cumulative in nature. She shot Mr. Burns because he messed with her entire family. Bart getting injured in the backyard is important. Homer's identity crisis is important. Lisa's education, and therefore the school's oil by extension, is important. Marge Simpson, on the other hand, is not given a specific motive scene because she simply doesn't need one. Marge is a homemaker. Her entire job is to look out for the well-being of her family. There's a reason why the term Mama Bear exists, you know. And what's really cool about Part 1 from a storytelling perspective is that it perfectly demonstrates a progression of how Marge feels about the situation. The first time she shows up, she excitedly talks about how happy she is for the school and the opportunities the money will provide. So far, everything is all rainbows and sunshine. But as things go south, so does Marge's attitude. First, she's characterizing Burns' actions as inconsiderate and selfish. And then later at the town hall meeting, her chief complaint is that Burns is causing everyone to yell. Oh my goodness, how horrible. The funny thing is that if Marge Simpson were actually the shooter, this is exactly how the writers would portray these scenes. Throughout all of Part 1, Marge's motive is treated like one big joke at how ridiculously understated her reactions are. And as we all know, the writers have quite a history of hiding clues in jokes. Look at how they hid the clues in Black Widower, for example, or how they hid the candy from a baby clue in The Official Solution. In a comedy, if you're trying to hide a clue, burying it in a joke is the first place to do it. So if you're trying to downplay a motive, the best thing to do is make fun of it. So that establishes her motive. What happens next? The town hall meeting breaks up, Marge drops everyone off in the car, wonders where her family is, and leaves to go look for them. But does she? The episode does not show her leave the parking lot, we only see her later when she's out in front of town hall. Isn't it possible that Marge stayed nearby and witnessed Mr. Burns approach the car? Or at the very least, was about to leave and heard the commotion? We certainly heard it from around the corner, so why couldn't she? Think about it this way. Marge drops them off, begins to leave, and notices Mr. Burns arrive. She then witnesses Mr. Burns attempt to steal a piece of candy from Maggie. And from Marge's point of view, this event is the last straw. She has now seen Mr. Burns systematically mess with Homer, Bart, and Lisa, and now he has the indecency to go after Maggie, who is merely a baby. The character progression from Act 1 is now complete. Mr. Burns has literally messed with her entire family. For a repressed character like Marge, this is exactly the kind of thing that could tip her over the edge. It's my theory that she angrily returned to the car, easily wrestled the gun away from Burns, and shot him. She wipes her prints off the gun, tosses it in the car, and immediately flees the scene. She walks to the front of town hall and proclaims, "Where is everybody?" And then, we hear the world's most coincidental gunshot. Yeah, about that gunshot. I guess it's time to finally address one of the elephants in the room. If Marge is the only possible cover-up suspect, then how can we account for her alibi? She is specifically shown to be standing in front of Town Hall when we hear the gunshot, so she should be the first person we eliminate as a suspect. But my question is, how do we know that was the Mr. Burns gunshot? Remember what we learned about Smithers in Part 2. Thanks to Jasper, we now know that Burns was not the only person in the vicinity who was shot that night. And yet in Part 1, we only hear one gunshot. It's curious. Why didn't anyone hear the Smithers gunshot? How is it possible for no one to have even noticed? Although really, how is it possible that no one saw anything with the Burns shooting either? Come on, there were like a bajillion people at the meeting. Whichever way you slice it though, there's always going to be one gunshot we don't know anything about. Why can't this gunshot be the one that hit Jasper? Remember, we hear the gunshot and Mr. Burns immediately appears around the corner. Kind of amazing how quickly a wounded man can lurch his way out of the parking lot, especially since the car was a decent ways away from the corner of the building. I think he was shot a minute or so earlier, and Burns basically staggers after Marge when she departs. And yes, I realize how hilariously unfair this would be if this were the real solution, since the contest would be telling you to solve it without even knowing about the Smithers shooting. It would be like, oh well, that gunshot was actually one you couldn't have known about yet. It's the kind of thing they would pull off in a Sherlock Holmes short story. However, as I outlined in the first video, mysteries are actually solved in the evidence collecting section in Part 2. So it's fair game when looking at both parts together. It's just amazingly and astonishingly coincidental for this particular theory. It's also worth noting that Marge actually returns to the scene of the crime to pick up Maggie afterwards. Note how Maggie is suddenly here for the Sundial meeting. It's unknown precisely why she went back there, possibly just to check on Maggie, but she might be double checking the scene of the crime just in case. So that wraps things up for Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1. Let's move on to the second part. Marge's role in Part 2 is very simple and very consistent. Her basic purpose is to blame, and stay out of the spotlight. She is consistently the family member who tries to downplay any analysis of the shooting and lead the discussion away from the family. When Lisa mentions the possibility of a family member being the shooter, it's Marge who quickly changes the subject, saying, "The police already have a suspect. It's Mr. Smithers." Then, when Smithers is cleared, Marge disappointingly remarks that it's never the person you most suspect. Furthermore, when Lisa wants to get involved in the investigation, Marge discourages her. But the most interesting part comes when the Simpsons' DNA is discovered and Homer is arrested. Lisa tells her that it could have come from any of them, except for Marge, since she's a Bouvier. Marge says something very strange right here. She says, and I quote, "When I took your father's name, I took everything that came with it, including DNA." This is obviously a Marge is dumb joke, the kind of joke they normally do with Homer, but look at it from Marge's point of view if she's the shooter. She knows she approached Burns and shot him, and she knows Simpson's DNA landed on him. So the easy conclusion to come to is that it simply came from her. The DNA actually came from Maggie during the candy struggle, but it'll be an amazingly easy thing to overlook, especially after shooting a man in cold blood. Then they discuss the gun and Lisa says this, "We don't even know whose gun that was. Maybe someone planted it there to frame Dad." And Marge replies, "No, we can't start thinking that way about our own family members. Suspicion could tear us apart." Maybe I'm missing something, but who said anything about a family member framing him? Yeah, they were initially talking about Simpson's DNA, but Lisa changed the subject to talk about whose gun it was. I admit, this line has always felt kinda weird in the original script. It's odd that Marge would leap to the conclusion that it has to be a family member who left the gun in the car. There remains a question of why Marge simply didn't turn herself in after her husband was accused by Burns. I mean, it would be pretty awful for her to let him take the fall, even if, he did it to her several seasons later. But I think Marge turning herself in is kind of difficult when you have Burns himself accusing Homer. Why on earth would anyone believe her over Burns? They would write it off as the wife trying to protect her husband. Speaking of accusations, let's talk about the conclusion of the episode. Ultimately, Who Shot Mr. Burns ends up following the exact same story arc as the second half of Marge Gets a Job. Marge wounds Mr. Burns, he lashes out at her, he thinks about his actions, feels bad about himself, and eventually lets Marge go free. Marge Gets a Job is ultimately a story of redemption, and Who Shot Mr. Burns follows the exact same path. Don't get me wrong, Mr. Burns isn't stupid. He knows that Marge shot him after the Maggie incident, and he is initially very angry about it. So angry, he literally accuses her in his dying breath by pointing to the letters M and S. But after recovering in the hospital, he thinks about the situation. And then when Homer stands up to him at the end of Act 3, what happens? The exact same thing as Marge Gets a Job. Burns lets Homer and Marge go free. And when Lisa brings up the sundial clue, Burns chooses to deny. And to put a cherry on top of the whole situation, Marge tells Mr. Burns she's sure Maggie didn't mean it and that it was just an accident. I mean, come on you guys, the woman is practically speaking in code right here. Just look at that smug grin on her face. And that's basically it. The Marge Simpson solution obviously has its share of problems, particularly in that it relies on a huge coincidence with the gunshot, as well as some slight plausibility issues with the timing. We would be suggesting that all of this would be able to occur in the course of a few minutes. But what the Marge Simpson solution does is explain the structure of Part 1 as well as the dual nature of the sundial clue. The writers had to spend forever on motive scenes because a whole bunch of them actually mattered. The sundial clue had to be both an accusation and a coincidence because Mr. Burns changes his mind about it. And it may even explain why Mr. Burns subconsciously lashes out at Marge's husband when he wakes up. Although trying to tie in that obvious joke into this theory is probably getting too greedy, so I'll stop right here. That's it for Part 2. I told you guys in advance that any solution we come up with is going to be cuckoo bananas, and I certainly proved it. But try watching these 2 episodes with Marge in mind. It actually kind of works. Stay tuned for Part 3 of this ridiculous trilogy, where we travel further through the looking glass and identify the other suspect who might have gotten away with attempted murder.